All right, so guys, I'm here with Dr. Milo Wolf. Let's talk about long length partials, man.
Let's do it, man. That's my PhD right there.
All right, so first thing, I think most people listening will probably be at least like vaguely familiar with it because it's been pretty hyped up on social media lately. So for people who might be skeptical about long length partials, just like very briefly, how confident are you personally in them? Like, are you using them a lot in your own training with clients and this kind of thing? Again, not like the state of the literature. I just want to know, like, what does Milo Wolf, the bodybuilder, think about long length partials?
Yeah. As a bodybuilder, I'm pretty confident that at the very least, you're not missing out on anything. I think you'd be hard pressed to make that case. And so, personally, in my own training for about 9 or 10 months now, I've been doing exclusively lengthened partials for all of my hypertrophy work. Before that, I was still emphasizing lengthened position, for example, doing partials at the end of the set or using certain exercises, pausing at lengthened position. But generally, I'm honestly pretty confident. And I'm also a coach. And with my clients programming, typically somewhere between 25 to 50% of the work will be lengthened partials if their main goal is hypertrophy. Obviously, if you have other goals like performance or strength, that's going to be different. But by and large, at this point, I'm pretty confident that lengthened partials are something that should be included in your training if you're after hypertrophy.
Gotcha. So first, I guess I should just explain how I usually describe what lengthened partials are to people. So most people know what a full range of motion is, even though that's a bit like dicey to define when you really try to break it down. But like if we were to look at a bicep curl, like we kind of intuitively know what a full range of motion is. So like you're fully extended at the bottom and you curl more or less all the way up to the shoulder pretty much. Um, so if you were going to do a partial rep, you could do that in a whole bunch of different ways. One way would be to do it in the top half only, right? So that would be a short length partial because the bicep is contracted, which means it's shorter. So that'd be a short length partial. You could do a partial rep kind of in the middle of the range of motion. So that would be like a lot of bodybuilders, maybe like 5-10 years ago used to do this. So it was like stay in that quote unquote active mid-range type of partial. And then the third way you could do it would be to do it in the bottom half of the curl where the muscle is more stretched, and that would be the long length partial. So that's what we're talking about. And I think you and honestly mainly you, but you and some other people have been, I guess, spearheading this idea that long length partials might like almost certainly have merit when it comes to a bodybuilding program.
100%. And I think at this stage, I'm sure we'll dive into the evidence a little bit down the line. But I think at this stage, with the evidence being in the place that it is, if you haven't heard of lengthened partials, you should definitely consider incorporating them. I think shortened partials, from the evidence we have, are really not a good idea. They are consistently worse than full range of motion, consistently worse than lengthened partials. And meanwhile, sort of constant tension partials, where you might exclude the full stretch and the full squeeze, those seem to be about as effective as full range of motion, from what we know.
Interesting. What I've noticed when I speak about lengthened partials or anything that's like kind of new and exciting in bodybuilding, there's a camp of people who are like, oh, this is the new sexy thing that everyone's talking about, and I'm sure the hype will die down and this kind of thing. So like, I'm sure you've heard that as well, right? So far with this? Yeah. So like to address that, like for those skeptics, like maybe you can give us something to grab onto. Like we have this many studies about this now, and we've been using it with success in the field for a while now. So there's no real reason to be like that skeptical about it. And again, I should reiterate that neither you nor I are advertising this as like a really, really groundbreaking thing. It's just like, hey, if you're not trying this, like it really does seem to work.
100%. So, on your note of not being groundbreaking, we're expecting an improvement in your growth of maybe 5 or 10% using lengthened partials versus full range of motion. So, if you're all about maximizing your hypertrophy, that's meaningful. But for most people, it's not going to be world changing, right? It's also not as though doing partial reps is anything new. If you look at a lot of bodybuilders training 20, 30 years ago, even now, a lot of them do partials. And at the very least, range of motion, not doing full range of motion in this case, doesn't seem to have such a detrimental impact that they're not able to still compete at a high level, right? So at the very least, it's not hugely influential or really holding them back. I do think that with this specifically, people have the instant rebuttal of, well, it's just a technique, right? Like it's just an intensity technique, just like drop sets or holding in the shortened position, like an iso hold, or a lot of other things. And while I do think that you can view a lot of like non-traditional set structures or techniques as just being sort of for intensity, equally, when you're talking about range of motion, really, you should be picking the range of motion that lets you grow the most muscle. Because ultimately, you're in the gym to grow muscle, not to be more intense or less intense.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So when it comes to the research, like off the top of your head, can you think of like how many studies do we have that actually investigate full range of motion versus long length partial range of motion? And then, well, I'll let you answer that first, but then foreshadowing, I'm going to want to know long length partials versus short length partials. Like, how does the evidence stack up for each of those? So start with full range of motion, which is what I think most people default to who like kind of have a clue about training, versus lengthened partials.
100%. So regarding full range of motion versus lengthened partials, we currently have 5 studies. One of those has only been presented at a conference as an abstract, so take it with a grain of salt. But let's include that for now. In those 5 studies, 4 have shown a benefit in terms of hypertrophy of lengthened partials over full range of motion. So straight up, just more muscle growth, significantly. And then in that 5th study, there were no differences. In other words, currently, out of 5 studies, there is no single study where you grow more muscle doing a full range of motion versus doing lengthened partials, which is pretty convincing, right? So if you want to view it in a very sort of simple way, you could say, well, if I incorporate lengthened partials instead of full range of motion, I'll probably see a neutral to positive effect on my muscle growth, which ultimately is what you're after, just grow more muscle, really. And then with regards to comparing lengthened partials, so partial reps in that stretch position, to shortened partials, like the top of a bicep curl, very consistently across 8 studies, we see that lengthened partials are better for hypertrophy than shortened partials. In fact, out of these 8 studies, 7 show a significant benefit to lengthened partials over shortened partials for hypertrophy, and 1 shows no difference, or a null result. So again, very consistently in both the 5 studies comparing lengthened partials to a full range of motion, and the 8 studies comparing shortened partials to lengthened partials, it's super consistent, right? Like longer muscle length training seems to be better for hypertrophy, such that the sort of hierarchy, or the sort of, the hierarchy is full range of motion somewhere in the middle. Shortened partials are worse than full range of motion, but lengthened partials are better than full range of motion. Likely, it seems, because longer muscle length training appears to be better for growth.
Okay, so just to back up for a second, I think when we were like explaining long length partials, I used the bicep example. Is there a way that because I think some people have a hard time wrapping their head around this, like when I've tried to use it with like clients or just people I'm training with in person, they're like, oh, is it like, depending on the exercise, they'll get a little confused. Like on a lat pull down, they'll be like, oh, it's the bottom part, right? So it must be the part where I'm down here. And it's like, no, actually with that, your lats are stretched when your arms are more up overhead. But then with a squat, your glutes and quads are more stretched when they're more in the hole. So like, is there a way that you found to be like effective at communicating to people what a long length partial is across different exercises?
100%. I think most clients just think whichever part of the range of motion I feel a muscle in the most must be the lengthened part, and that's the part I got to focus on. So for the pull down, you mostly feel at the bottom because that's why it's hard. So the simplest way I found is to simply have clients break down their lifting into a lifting and lowering phase, or a concentric and eccentric phase, right? And after your lowering phase is when your muscle is most lengthened. So if you just do the first half of the rep from that lift starting position after the lowering phase, that's why you'll get the half rep in the lengthened position, or lengthened partial.
Gotcha. And then when we look at these studies, are we looking like, so you're making kind of like a bit of a broad claim that like lengthened partials seem to be better than full range of motion. But really we only have like 5 actual like 4 peer-reviewed published studies and 1 conference abstract. So like, are there any, just in your own experience and like based on your hunch, having contributed to the evidence a lot, like, are there certain exercises where you're like, these are the ones I would definitely try lengthened partials on first, and these are the ones that I'm not 100% sure would be as effective if there are any?
Sure. So I think we can talk about muscle groups that potentially benefit more so. And this isn't because these muscle groups are somehow unique, but it's more so about what exercises we typically use to target them. So when you do most back training, for example, like let's say a pull down or a pull up or a row, almost all of these exercises are going to be most challenging in that shortened position, which is the opposite of what we want. As I just mentioned, lengthened training, by and large, really good for muscle growth. And so on these exercises, where the shortened position is most challenging, is typically where lengthened partials come in the most useful, right? There is an exception where, let's say, for example, on a dumbbell kickback, right, a movement you've been talking about lately. On that movement, if you were to perform lengthened partials, it probably wouldn't be the best use of your time, simply because there's literally no tension at the bottom. And so even if you were to use lengthened partials, it would be really difficult to effectively load it enough to become a good lengthened partial exercise.
Yeah.
And so you want some tension in the lengthened position, but it's going to be most useful on exercises where it's really challenging that shortened position. So back work, like bicep work typically, side delt work especially, those are the main muscle groups that benefit. Certain exercises, fortunately, are kind of lengthened partials by design. For example, a dumbbell fly, right, where the bottom position is already the most challenging, that fully lengthened position, and it gets easier and easier as you shorten the pecs. Ditto for the pullover, for the lats. These exercises are already lengthened partials, and so on these, whether or not you decide to exclude that top part of the range of motion probably doesn't matter a lot. You could do it and it would kind of result in a more constant tension approach, which might be something you're into. It can be fun to play around with. But these movements tend to just be better on principle on account of targeting that lengthened position more, putting more tension in that position, and in the first place, allowing you to stretch the lats or the chest in this case.
So that sounds a little bit counterintuitive to me on the first point. You're saying that you think lengthened partials would be more effective on exercises that overload the short position more. Wouldn't you think intuitively that lengthened partials would be better for an exercise that place more tension in the lengthened position? Why do you think it works that way?
So I think if you're going to use lengthened partials on a movement that's already quite challenging in that lengthened position, you're not really changing the movement much, right? Let's say, for example, on a leg press, you're cutting out a lockout. All you're really doing at that point is just taking away some of the time you were spending at short muscle lengths, but where you were essentially resting anyways. And so you were still going to have the most challenge in a lengthened position, right? Whereas if you perform lengthened partials on a shortened overloaded movement where it's really challenging in that shortened position, that's where it's going to allow you to use a lot more weight and to make, at least in terms of lengthened partials, more use of it. Because all of a sudden you're going from, say, on a pull down, typically you'll be able to use, say, 20 to 30% more weight doing lengthened partials, which is often indicative that, hey, the movement is pretty shortened biased. Because if by doing lengthened partials you're able to lift more, that indicates that it's quite a movement that's quite limited by shortened strength, essentially.
Yeah, that makes sense. So just to make sure everybody kind of got that, I think, so when we talk about an exercise that's shortened, more challenging in the shortened aspect, it basically means like it's really hard to get a full squeeze on that exercise. So I think that the classic example, or the one I often use, is a lying leg curl, a lying hamstring curl, where like after maybe like an 8-rep set, it becomes really hard to get the pad all the way up to touch your butt. But you could probably do another 10, 12, 15 reps with half reps. So like that would be an example of an exercise that is naturally more short muscle length biased, and as a result would benefit more by prioritizing the long length more, because you get a big gap between the amount of tension that you're able to place on the muscle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have Nordic curls, right? Where the movement's already going to be by far the most challenging when you get into that stress position. And so even if you were to do lengthened partials on these, like you're not really changing the movement much, because at the top there's essentially no resistance to be had.
So you mentioned the dumbbell tricep kickback as an exercise where you wouldn't recommend doing a lengthened partial, but I'm pretty sure you just wouldn't recommend that exercise anyway. Like there's almost any other tricep exercise would probably be better than the dumbbell kickback, which I think I'd probably agree with, unless there was some exercise that just like really cranked your shoulders in a bad way or something like that. Now we can debate about this, but that might be another a topic for another day. I do think that the cable kickback is not only a okay alternative, I think it's a smart option to include in your program. But I'm getting a little off track here, because what I wanted to know is, of the common exercises that you'd recommend, are there any out of those that you wouldn't recommend or necessarily be like super hyped about people doing long length partials on? So for example, you mentioned the leg press and you were like, well, you can do lengthened partials on them, but you just might not get like as much of a difference out of that exercise as doing full ROM, because they're already kind of lengthened partially anyway, right? So like, is there any other exercise you can think of that you would be like, maybe, yeah, lengthened partials might not be something I'd actually do on those?
100%. So as I mentioned, I think really exercises that don't have any tension in the lengthened position, like a dumbbell ladder raise, it may not matter that much. You can't really do lengthened partials to begin with very well. Same with dumbbell kickbacks, for example, and like bent over rear delt dumbbell flies, for example, which is
Yeah.
quite a specific exercise, but that also would be hard to do. So beyond those, to be honest, I think the main ones I wouldn't recommend it on as a standalone approach would be exercises where you can safely fail with a partial, right? For example, if your leg press doesn't have any low safeties and you want to take a set of lengthened partial leg presses close to failure, you're not going to be able to re-rack the weight. The same can go for benching on your own, right? Let's say you're benching on your own, doing lengthened partials on the barbell bench just might not be the best approach because you're always at some risk of you don't get that last rep and you get crushed, right?
Yeah.
That's simply not a wise move. And so I think for those movements where it's less safe to do so, I think other techniques like integrated partials, like lengthened supersets, essentially doing lengthened partials at the end of your full range of motion set, those can come in handy to an extent to somewhat limit those limitations of safety, or you can simply keep those sets a little bit more submaximal, maybe train with a couple reps in the tank typically.
Gotcha. Okay, that's actually, yeah, I actually hadn't really thought of that. So I have a video coming out about this where I basically, in it, I describe two ways that I personally have been using long length partials. The first way is essentially as an intensity technique at the end of my last set. So once I exhaust my ability to use a full range of motion, I keep going with lengthened partials. And so I mainly do that on back exercises like pull downs, pull ups, and hamstring exercises, especially leg curls. Then the second way, which is actually the more common way that I use them through your recommendation, is for the last set of certain exercises, I'll just do every rep of that set as a lengthened partial. So for example, on dumbbell flies, which you mentioned, I'll just only do half reps in the stretched aspect. And then also on leg extensions for my last set, I'll only go about halfway up. But I think you had mentioned two, or at least one or two other ways to do long length partials. One is as an integrated partial, which is basically where you just integrate your partials throughout the set. So like you do one rep with a full range of motion, then one rep with a half range of motion in the stretched aspect, and you just do that throughout the set. And you said that those are helpful for exercises where like it might not be necessarily safe to fail if you were to just do long length partials because you wouldn't be able to get the weight back up.
Correct. Yeah. And the important thing with those as well is that compared to just doing partials at the end of your set, let's say, for example, you're doing a set of 10 dumbbell flies, right? In scenario one, you do 10 sets with 10 reps with full range of motion, and then you can get 3 more partials at the end. Overall, yeah, you did 3 partials, but the emphasis of the set wasn't shifted by that much towards more lengthened positions.
Yeah.
However, if you did one full rep and then one lengthened rep and went back and forth, what would happen is by the end of the set, you might get 7 full range of motion reps and 7 partials. That's a much more substantive shift towards that stretch position than if you just done the partials at the end. And it has the additional benefit of, if you're doing a leg press, for example, you could do that and safely fail or safely get closer to failure than if you just did partials. The final thing is the ratio of full reps to lengthened partial reps using integrated partials can be modified depending on what you want to achieve, right? If you're simply looking to maximize the lengthen bias, you could technically just do lengthened partials until that last rep where you finish with a full rep, right? Where technically it would be an integrated partial set because you did both full and lengthened partials. But alternatively, you could, for example, just keep a 1-to-1 ratio or a 1-to-3 ratio if you're just looking for a more traditional way of incorporating lengthened partials.
So when you say like a 1-to-3 ratio, you would do 1 full range of motion rep, then you would do 3 long length partials, then 1 full. That's cool. I've never tried that. I've always done a 1-to-1 ratio. Wait, the other thing you mentioned was you do long length partials for, let's say you're doing a set of 12. So you do long length partials for reps 1 to 11, and then for rep 12 you use a full range. Why? Like, what's the point of that? Like, that sounds really freaky.
Well, so essentially you get most of the benefits of lengthened partials, right? Like you get to do almost all of your set as partials. So you get to shift the emphasis of the set to being a lot more stretched. But you also get the safety benefit of not risking failing a partial and being crushed. You get to finish the set when you hit, quote unquote, full range of motion failure. So yes, you'll be stopping the set a little bit earlier than you possibly could if you just did partials until failure, which actually is probably part of the benefit of partials, is that it pushes you closer to, quote unquote, physiological failure, right? Like if you ended a set when you simply couldn't do a full rep anymore, for example, on those lying leg curls, you might still be able to do 10, 15 partials, as you mentioned. And so maybe, and it likely is the case, part of the benefit of lengthened partials is that it allows you to push a little bit closer to true failure, quote unquote.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think unwittingly I've kind of been doing that approach on leg presses, because like if I do lengthened partials on leg presses, on that last rep, I do grind it all the way up. So that does make sense. What do lengthened partials actually look like for you? Are you going a quarter of the way up, halfway up, 3/4 of the way up? And then is your goal to match that distance traveled, or is it acceptable to have that distance decrease as you get closer and closer to failure?
So generally, I think a really good ballpark to start with is half reps. In the 5 studies I mentioned, in 4 of those, they actually compared half reps, so half reps in a lengthened position, to a full range of motion. So as a general principle, when you're trying to apply some findings from the evidence to your own training, keep in mind what the context was. In this case, we're talking about half reps, not quarter reps, not 3/4. And so I think one common mistake people make is that they go and do 90% of the rep, essentially, right? They just skip the lockout and they basically do a full range of motion still. In order to get the full benefit of lengthened partials, you probably do want to cut the range of motion down by a pretty substantial amount. Otherwise, you wouldn't get the benefit. And so I think about half reps is a really good starting point. The good news is, at least for now, we don't know whether, for example, quarter reps might be better. So as long as you're somewhere in the ballpark of half reps, you're probably in the clear. That's where I'd start. What I would look for is a certain landmark or a certain feature of the machine that you can use to standardize range of motion week to week. So for example, on a barbell row, right, you could simply row the bar until it clears the knee level, and then you control it back down, get a deep stretch, right? That way, if you're always pulling just above your knees, you have a really standardizable approach and range of motion that you can replicate week to week and have your performance actually be a valid assessment, for example, of recovery, and be able to track progression a lot more easily. So I think standardizing range of motion and aiming for around half reps is a really good first approach.
Okay. So let's just say I'm doing dumbbell rows, okay? And I'm like, all right, it's my last set. I'm going to do lengthened partials for a set of 10, okay? So I row the dumbbell halfway up, right? And I get to rep 10, and I can only get it about 40% of the way up. Hypothetically, I could go for an 11th rep and get it 35% of the way up. And then I could go for a 12th rep and get it 30% of the way up. And then a 13th rep and get it 25% of the way up. And then a 14th rep and get it 25% of the way up again. And then a 15th rep and get it 20% up. And, so on until I'm like barely moving the dumbbell, like just a tiny little bit of range of motion. So it's like you have this slippery slope where it's like, where do we actually terminate a set when we're like allowing wiggle room with those lengthened partials? So my question is, if you standardize it to 50%, is the termination point or the failure point on that set when I can no longer get to 50%? Or do you allow a little bit of wiggle room there? Or do you just go all the way down until you literally can't move the dumbbell?
Sure. So I think there's a few layers to the answer to this question.
Sure.
Number one is safety. On certain movements, if you allow that failure point to drift too far back, you actually might not be able to safely fail anymore. I'll give you an example. My leg press has some safeties that are very low. And so when I'm doing lengthened partials, I can actually leg press with just lengthened partials and then re-rack the weight at the end. However, if I fail to even get the weight far up enough to hit this safety and be able to re-rack it safely, it's not so safe anymore. And so in movements where it otherwise wouldn't be safe to shift that failure point, definitely keep it at wherever you used to. Stop the set as soon as you think you're not able to get that range of motion anymore. The answer to if safety is not a concern to that question is it really depends on your definition of failure and what you deem the research on failure to be like. The most recent analyses on training to failure or not generally show that on a per set basis, if you're comparing one set to not failure, for example with 3 reps in the tank, to one set to failure, training closer to failure does produce more growth. In fact, each rep as you get closer to failure becomes more and more stimulating. So that last rep before you hit failure is likely more stimulating than the first rep of your set. And so if you really want to take advantage of this phenomenon of the closer to failure you go and potentially past failure you go, the more growth you get, you could certainly say, look, I'm willing to accept reps that are as small as 20% of the range of motion. I think my issue with that approach are twofold. One, we don't have much research on forced reps. We're essentially kind of the definition here, which is like shifting the failure point and going past what would be considered in the research that we have to be the failure point that we have researched. And so you could potentially get more growth going past failure and getting quarter reps or fifth reps, right? The truth is, we just don't know. So it might be the case, it might not be. What we do know is that the closer to failure you train, generally, the more fatiguing training becomes. So it's a relatively unknown trade-off, whether it's worth making. The second thing is, while we do have pretty compelling evidence at this point, as I mentioned, 5 studies, that half reps in the lengthened position are better than full range of motion, we're not super sure whether, for example, doing a tenth of the rep is still as good for hypertrophy as doing half the rep. And in fact, the only study we have that didn't look at half reps was a study using the leg press, where they compared doing 10% of the range of motion roughly to doing a full rep. So a partial range of motion in the lengthened position, doing just a 10% of the full range of motion versus doing 4 reps. And that's the one study, incidentally, where they didn't find a difference in growth between a full range of motion and lengthened partials.
But
so potentially...
But a 10th rep was still equally good as full ROM if it was in the stretch. I mean, that's pretty incredible in and of itself, honestly. So I pretty much sign off on all those failure caveats. I do want to return to that study briefly because I haven't actually discussed that on my podcast. I have on my channel, but people might be like, wait, the last interview you did, it was like failure was really, really, really bad. So can you update this, please? So we'll do that really briefly within like 5 minutes. But that alone leads me to think that on these exercises where like you can actually get like a whole lot more reps. So I'm really only thinking for the most part hamstrings and back movements here. Like if you're going to follow the logic that like, yeah, you can crank out a lot more long length partial reps, then like you can also crank out a lot more long length quarter reps, So it's like, why not just like continue to kick that can down the road a little bit further, right? Now, the answer to that might be, well, at a certain point, you're just like, it becomes one of the drawbacks of just going to failure, like you kind of alluded to. Like, it's just really fatiguing. Like, if I'm going to do a set of 10 on lat pull downs and then do another 10, or like another 5 half reps, and then another 5 quarter reps, and then another 5 eighth reps, do you know what I mean? Like, at a certain point, it's like, it's just so fatiguing, right? That it might start to interfere with like volume or recovery or this kind of thing. But I feel like on an individual per set basis, like sounds like it might be better. Like it sounds like it might be better to just like keep cranking it as long as you're controlling it.
Yep. And man, if you can only train once a week or twice a week, for example, you probably want to make those trade-offs. You probably want to get the additional fatigue if it's going to get you any extra stimulus. And from the research we have, it does seem to. And if you look at some of the recent evidence around like super high volumes, I'm talking 20, 30 plus sets. If you're looking at the recent evidence on training to failure, it looks like both simply taking each set closer to failure and just doing more volume, obviously to a certain point, but that point might be higher than you previously thought. It seems like doing both of those leads to more growth. So it seems like potentially you just need to train really hard.
Yeah,
right?
if you can recover from it, which is a big if, because like for especially a general population demographic who isn't like their life, it doesn't resolve around fitness and this kind of thing. It's like you have all these other outside stressors that really can impact recovery and like increase injury 100%. Risk and all this sort of thing. So I think that those are actually like meaningful caveats. However, with that said, I do agree. Like on a per set basis, you consider us as robots. Like, yeah, it probably is just better, honestly, to just keep going. With that new study that came out, I did talk about this on my channel briefly. So I will link that in the show notes below. I still think it's more of an open question as to how beneficial it is going to failure versus stopping a few reps shy, even though I would agree that study did, in fact, show that no, it is better to go to failure than to stop a few reps shy. But I think when you look at some of the sub-analyses there, it does kind of change depending on like what the specific rep range is that you're working on and some of these other things. And then as I'm sure you're aware, there was another meta-analysis published the previous year, which included a few less studies, that their basic takeaway was like, yeah, you do see more muscle growth as you approach failure. But then once you get to that point where you're like 1-2 reps in the tank, it kind of levels off. And so there isn't actually a meaningful difference. So like it seems to depend on which specific studies you include. And then this isn't to mention the fact that there will be a trade-off between volume and intensity of effort, right? So like the more failure training you do, the harder it is going to be to do more and more volume as well and still recover. And so you still end up having that trade-off. Now, the question is, which one do you prioritize, right? Do you prioritize taking sets to failure and then trying to increase the volume? Or do you prioritize trying to establish a higher level of volume and then try to titrate in failure from there? Yeah. At the moment, I'd probably lean towards like, push, like definitely get some sets to failure, honestly. Like that's my personal opinion. But I think some people would dispute the idea that like the current evidence shows quite conclusively that like going to failure is significantly, or I would say practically meaningfully different than stopping a few reps shy. Like I think there's some wiggle room on that statement.
There's for sure some room for interpretation there. What I'll say regarding the subgroup analyses is that whenever you're splitting up data and looking only at certain subsets of data, you're going to see some different shapes. I think whenever you're talking about a relatively complex topic, and in this case, they did a lot of subgroup analyses and moderate analyses. And if you squint just right, you could find that some of them might tell you something. But equally, you might just find out that, hey, if we look at only 3 studies out of the 30 that they looked at overall, we can find some weird stuff. So I would say mostly stick to the overall data. The final thing I'd say is this meta-analysis did include a lot more studies than previous ones, so I personally ascribe a little bit more to it, but I do agree that the question of should you push volume or intensity is a huge one, and it's one that's relatively unanswered until now. The good news is I actually am friends with the authors of the failure study that we just mentioned, and they are planning on doing some analyses, trying to see and parse out whether volume or relative intensity play a bigger role for hypertrophy. Awesome. And that's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, I can't wait for that. Yeah, and we could go on about this for hours, I'm sure, as we should probably do sometime. But I think I'm going to leave it there for now. That was absolutely fantastic. I think people are really going to enjoy this conversation, man. It was good. I actually learned a few things that I'm going to apply right away as well. So I really appreciate your time, man.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it.